Last night I read a tweet that said something about how observing a number of trees and shrubs and birds can improve mental health. And they did a study where they counted like the number of birds and varieties and things like that people would see and if it affected their mental health. And it showed to have a positive benefit. And I was thinking, well, duh. Like, why do we need science? Like, why are scientists doing science on these, like, totally obvious things? Why not just give the money to the people in the study so they can actually go out and maybe get a bird instead of studying the obvious? It's so ridiculous. And I had an insight into insight and sharing. Feeling like just by sharing insight, it will maybe provide insight into what it's like to see if I see and speak as that which I see, as opposed to just the me. And in this way, I'm learning a new language. I'm using language in terms of perception, which is seeing in the moment as opposed to thought and past me constructs. And I remember when I first went into so-called mania 6 years ago, I was trying to create new words and new language. So I think that was actually part of the process, was this instinct to create a new language based on the way my brain was now working. And maybe by speaking in that way, in that new language, which isn't necessarily different from English, but it's using English differently instead of English using us. And that would reinforce that way of seeing and communicating in the brain. So it's the brain wanting to communicate in a different way based on seeing connections. And I was watching Krishnamurti's talk with Dr. David Bohm called The Future of Humanity. And Krishnamurti mentioned that thought dominates our relationships, or that thought has become dominant in human relationships. And I was thinking to myself, well, what else could become dominant in human relationships? And that might be speaking as insight, or speaking based on insights and perceptions. And again, it's this reversal switch of neurogenesis, using the light of perception to create sound, and then doing that together and thinking together. And I had a conversation with one of my friends today, and it seems that we're going to be attempting to play with some ideas and just see what happens. And after our 3-hour conversation, I had this sense that he and I have the same brain. Like, we're able to talk that way for that long because we have the same brain. Because I was in a dialogue the other day and I raised the question, and I don't even know if I said this to myself, that if we all left all our past conditioning at the door and we were all a clean slate adult brain, what would we talk about? What would that conversation and dialogue look like? And in that way, I feel like his brain and my brain are pretty congruent. It's almost like, even though our brains aren't entirely conditioning free, we have these same values through our experiences, and I feel like our brains have been transformed and transmuted in these same ways. So we had a conversation and figured out that we can go about this process of being co-creative and just seeing what happens. And I think that's cool because it's a way to have dialogue with another person, to put certain things into play, because it's not just about talking about how a manic brain works and reframing and creating that context for the manic brain to see itself as just fine the way it is, but then also putting the manic brain to work. So it's one way for it to see how it works, and it's another way for it to go to work. So we're going to go to work together, and we're going to go to work in the manic way, and which is just infinite and chaotic. And it's almost like this new generating ideas and pruning the ideas together and putting our brains together and seeing what happens. And it's possible that nothing will happen, and it's possible that something will happen, but we can't even really know what that is. And it might take a while for it to kind of get going, or it could, I have no idea how it's going to go, but what I'm saying is, I was even saying to him that even in talking with myself, I have to look at the page and then say my idea and then talk for a while and then go to the next. But in conversation with him, we talked for 3 hours nonstop, and there was no pausing to look at a notebook. So there's no editing. So the process of talking to oneself isn't as powerful as putting one's brain together with another, even just in creating dialogue and conversation. It's more natural because we can just pass that energy back and forth. And he gave me permission to talk about this to myself, and I want to talk about it here and there because it's sort of the next iteration of the conversation, is having that conversation with somebody else, and not just about the context I've created for myself, which I can't remember anyways, but what can we create when we both have brains of similar context? And I think that it's one thing to want to heal, and it's another thing to be creative, and then the concept of healing loses its meaning. And I was thinking about even my journey to want to come off meds. If I'm being co-creative and able to design a life exactly how I would envision, or even in alignment with the vision that I was shown and given the blueprint of in Mania, then maybe that is the healing, and then the need to basically coming off meds might be easier when I'm living a life that is in alignment with that vision. And the chances of me creating that vision are higher if I'm in alignment with somebody else. And I think I already talked about how psychoactive drugs, in a way, are a way to keep the psyche and thought in order, when the process of map consciousness is actually something beyond thought. So it's like taking those drugs is like artificial thought, whereas the process of map consciousness is introducing a new form of intelligence. It's not really new, but it's new to most of us. And so it's an artificial self. And I think that's pretty similar to what I talked about with the chemical ego band-aid. And I wrote down that the amount of healing we need is inversely proportional to the amount of play and laughter we have. And playing with ideas and being creative, I feel like that goes along with play. It's a creative play, because this process we're going to start doesn't really have a motive, and it can go anywhere. So if it turns into something creative or business-esque, it would almost be like business for manic brains. Because so many of us are thought to be non-functional or having a difficult time functioning, but really it's just that the way our brains function is not being seen. And only we can see it, those of us who experience it. So we'll be playing not just with these ideas, but playing with how we might be able to create stuff. And I feel like insight and perception and intelligence is antivirus software. So again, thought is mind viruses, our own voice turned against ourself. And insight and perception, when we see something and we understand, it changes those structures. So it changes the thought and language viruses. And it's a different language, it's a deprogramming language. And I also had an insight when I was falling asleep, and I actually got up and wrote it down, because I had one or two the nights before and I didn't write them down, and I don't remember them. And I remember feeling like, I like that one, I want to keep it. So I wrote down that if the brain is not seeing meaning, it makes up stories. So it's always making up stories about me and the past and all these things. But if it's seeing meaning, it doesn't need to make up stories. Because it's hearing the language of the actual now, the meaning in the now, the relationships, the relatedness. And I had the sense of that because for some reason I felt a little story coming into my brain about something, and I sort of just saw this relationship between meaning and stories. Stories are like past content mixed together and rearranged and blah blah blah, whereas meaning, those stories need to be quiet if we're going to see anything meaningful, because stories are seen as meaning, but they're old dead meanings. Whereas if we're seeing meanings in the present, which is an ever flowing of awe that doesn't feel like awe because it's always just flowing, then our brain isn't going to make up stories. So to go with my co-creative project with my friend, I need to see if I can get my brain back into idea mode and how I want to share those ideas with him. And I feel like I talk about the way my brain works to use the brain in order to see. So seeing how the brain works, the brain can see. If the brain can see how it works, it can then see beyond just how it works. It can see how the universe works, because the universe works on the same rules as the brain, because the brain is that which we perceive the universe with. And the brain is learning this language of how to talk about how it works in order to learn another language altogether. It's translating the brain to be primarily this sound resonating device into a device of perceiving the light and giving voice to it. And when we can do that together, we can see the same thing together. We can talk about the same thing. We can unfold the same thing, which is our vision. I have some other notes, but I don't even know if I talked about them. I wrote down that we try to be good at remembering, but we need to be good at forgetting all the stuff that's in our mind, so something else can arise. Because when the brain is quiet, it can respond to the whole field of the mind. And I was talking to somebody, and it was interesting because we were talking about how sound and sight go together, and touch and gesture and movement. It's all this holistic thing, yet we separate the senses like they're these separate things, but really they're not. By looking at somebody's mouth while they're talking, we can understand what they're saying better. So the movement of their mouth is part of the communication. So in that same way, when we're perceiving holistically, we're perceiving so many dimensions of the whole field. And I was thinking about how sights become sounds, because I came out of a building and I looked up and I saw something, I think maybe the moon or something, and I said almost out loud, look at that. And I was saying it as if somebody was with me. And in a way, perception, seeing something so beautiful, there's this response to give voice to it and share that. Nobody was with me, but I said, look at that. Not just, oh, would you look at that, to myself, but look at that. So this perception wants to share the perception and see something together at the same time. I think there might be a direct correlation, an inverse relationship between thought and insight. And as one goes into map consciousness, one has more access to insight, the language of insight, hyperperception. And it's especially energizing and foreign the first time. But one, as one goes into those states more often, gets used to that language. And I don't mean language as in just words, but the whole energy field of it, impressing upon our body, mind, nervous system, and all of our senses, starts to attune us to that medium. Just like if we practice going in cold water, we'll get used to being in cold water and it won't really feel that cold. So it's being acclimated to those higher states or those other states. And then they don't necessarily even feel like higher states. They just feel like natural states that we have access to. Just like one can train to run a marathon and have access to that state physically, but one can also choose to walk. So, and walking and running a marathon aren't necessarily better than each other. It's just different abilities to use one's physicality in lots of different dimensions of what it means to be human. So it's just these other human dimensions that we might think are strange because people don't exercise in those domains. They just fear them. That would be like being afraid of a marathon runner because we can't run a marathon. And I might have said this one too. I need to keep track better of what I'm doing because now I'm writing stuff in notebooks. Because if I'm out and about, then I can just look at the notebook instead of having my laptop with my notes. But I wrote, we don't have enough random access memory when we're accessing memories randomly. Or even we think we are this random access memory, this RAM on the computer. But usually there's only several gigabytes of RAM accessing memory, but the hard drive is comparatively massive. And we can be the hard drive when we just stay in the whole field of information, and then the random accessor becomes the universal process of perception, the light coming towards us, the information coming into us. I feel like we are mishearing and misseeing the universe. And we don't hear the universe because we hear the me saying its verses. And I really think I said this stuff, but I don't actually know for sure. And that's the trouble with, for me, trying to create anything beyond just talking to myself, is that I don't have any memory, very vague. And I was thinking about Dr. Daniel Siegel, how he says the mind uses the brain to create itself. And when I thought about that, I sort of had this sense, I am the mind. Or when one disidentifies from the ego self, then one is the mind. There's no I to be the mind. There's just mind. And there was one other thing. I saw this wiki article about this Juana Maria of these islands off the coast of California. Someone told me about it. And then I read her wiki story, and it said something like she was living on this island for 18 years by herself. And then they brought her to the coast, and 7 weeks later she was dead. And they said 7 weeks later she was dead from these diseases. And I was thinking to myself, no, she was in this beautiful paradise and adapted to that. And then she was brought into this toxic society, and 7 weeks later she was dead. To me, it was more of an illustration of that, not that she had some kind of illness. She probably had no immunity to the diseases of society, and she wasn't adapted to that at all, and she quickly died. It just made me think of people diagnosed with mental illnesses and how, in a way, our consciousness goes to paradise and then we come back to this world with everyone else. It's like we go to this island of paradise in our mind that's also here, but our consciousness goes there, and then when our consciousness comes back here, it nearly dies. And I wrote down, make sense of the senses. And then we don't have to make sense, we just sense. And I was thinking about this language that it seems my brain is learning to speak, and I wonder if I speak nature. I'm starting to learn the language of this land, the different bird sounds, the hummingbirds, the lizards, the sound of oranges falling. It goes on. When one is perceiving that and learning the language of that movement and those sounds and those sights and those smells, what else is there? And I was reading something by Krishnamurti, and he said, if one could be educated to discover the factors that produce order, it would have a great significance. And I have a feeling that has something to do with this language. It's the language of the order of nature, our relationship to it, and that includes us. And I opened a book, and randomly it opened to this page that said, and it was a quote by Krishnamurti, and it was the only quote on the page. It just said, when you destroy nature, you destroy yourself. And I'm pretty sure I talked to myself about how we are nature. So in speaking the language of nature and speaking as nature, we're actually speaking as ourself. And I actually feel like people who go into map consciousness, sometimes they connect with nature and the pain of nature, because it's nature trying to communicate with us through us at a distance, because it feels that we're disconnecting from it and thus destroying it. But it's translated into stuff against ourselves eventually, because we are destroying nature. So we're destroying ourselves. But then it seems like our thoughts are destroying us, but that's one way that probably nature can destroy us, is with our thoughts against ourselves. But it's just nature doing it. It's the whole of everything. There's no separation. That being said, it could happen that if it reaches a point where nature is getting destroyed too quickly, there could just be mass confusion in human beings at some point, to the point where there's more people that are supposedly crazy than sane. I feel like it would be cool to unfold some of this order. Part of that order would be seeing something for oneself. So seeing something directly versus being told, and then remembering, and then conforming to that as a pattern. When you can see directly for yourself, you don't need patterns, you don't need habits. There might be things that appear sort of habitual to others, but they're not necessary. We need sensitivity freedom to see, and to see the relationships between things. And there's an expansiveness in that.